Hello and welcome to the War Room number 27. In this video I'll be talking about a phenomenon that I've identified, which I'm calling single player and multiplayer. So to start with, I've loaded up as Brandenburg, and without any other information we can see there are a number of nations around us, and in a typical single player game our goal is to take over everything, not just a region, not to build tall, but to basically spread our name across the map. In working towards doing that, we have to pick our targets in a manner that allows us to expand most efficiently and basically do a cost-benefit risk analysis for every target that we attack. So as Brandenburg at the start of the game, going after Bohemia is probably a really bad idea given that they've got plenty of land, lots of strength to draw from. They're the emperor right now, they've got a number of vassals, so don't want to go in this direction. Meissen might not be the easiest target. They've got a lot of land to draw from. They could probably muster a lot of troops. Poland, probably same idea. And again, we're not considering who's allied to who right now. We're just looking at raw numbers. So our ideal targets are the ones that are low risk, low reward, and we want to take out as many of these as quickly as we possibly can. So our ideal targets are nations like Mecklenburg-Stargard, little one province miners that we can knock out pretty quickly. So as we annex these smaller nations, our power base grows, and so we find ourselves in a better position to take on even larger and more powerful nations. So take out the weakest nations around us, to build up our power base, to take out the more powerful nations, and so on. So start with the one province miners, work your way up to the two province miners. But anyway, if our goal is to blob, and our goal is always to blob, then we want to take out the easy targets first, work our way up towards the harder ones. In a single player game, it's pretty easy to identify which nations are the safer targets, and then knock those out first, and then work your way up to the more difficult ones. And even if you have coalitions and such, you can deal with those later on. Eventually get to the point where even the large nations don't stand a chance against you, and you can just steamroll across everyone. So that seems to be the general goal of a single player game, which is to spread your name across the map. As a nation's working towards its goal of taking over all the land in the area, of course it can make temporary alliances with its neighbors or with people slightly farther afield, whatever is advantageous for the time being. So as an example, I might ally Bohemia if I could, just to keep them from joining in a coalition against me while I pick off everyone else, and then turn around and annex Bohemia. Same thing with Poland. I might decide to keep everyone in the HRE happy as I go after Poland or after the Teutonic Order. So really you can go in any direction. It just depends on which way your cost-benefit analysis swings you, and which way you decide would be the easiest and most effective way to expand. Now, this is how you expand in a single player game, but in a multiplayer game this happens as well. In a multiplayer game, people start typically as one of several nations that have the potential to rise in stature on the world stage. So that might be a nation that's already a major, or it might be a nation that has the potential. But basically you're not going to start typically as a one province miner in a multiplayer game, so you have these same sort of considerations to go through. So as an example, the Ottomans have a number of nations that they can expand into depending on the circumstances as they are. Some of these are going to be much lower risk and lower reward, but it's typically better to take those out first. So as an example, expanding into Aden or Kandar is going to be usually safer than going into either Eretna or the Empire of the Romans or Bulgaria. So typically a player will take out all the small ones first and then expand into the larger ones next. So as we go through time, the player will take out the weaker targets around them and become stronger as a result, thereby better able to deal with the challenges of the larger nations around them as well as the other players that are around them. So let's jump from this hypothetical situation to an actual game situation. So over time in a multiplayer game, players will use the same cost-benefit risk analysis to take out the weaker targets around them, typically the one province minor AIs, and then working their way up to slightly more powerful AIs, and then eventually all of the AIs around them. And at some point you get a map that looks something like this, where basically the players have expanded to take out pretty much everything around them that isn't a player, and you get a pretty good idea of which nations are players just by looking at which nations are the most successful ones. So as an example, Castile here was a player taking out both Portugal and Aragon. France was a player expanding a little bit to the south. Netherlands was a player fully intact. Meanwhile, England is being ripped apart by a few different nations. England has taken part of Norway, but unfortunately that's a bit tenuous. Austria obviously is huge. You've got the Empire of the Romans fully intact and has taken out most of Anatolia. We've got Wallachia is huge, and then we've got a few other outliers here and there, but basically you get the idea that we've got players on France, Netherlands, Austria, Wallachia, Empire of the Romans, and Castile, and a few others that came and went. But the problem is eventually you run out of AIs to conquer. So at that point you've got a couple of options. Either you can look for AIs elsewhere, or you can go after other players. Now I have to load up a different save. So jumping ahead about another 100 years, we see the end result of that. France has focused most of its efforts on wiping out what's left of the UK. Spain has completely taken over Iberia and is now expanding down into Africa. Tlemcen was a player at one point. He's expanding south into Africa. Empire of the Romans, I'm not actually sure what he's doing. But Wallachia has expanded east. Austria has expanded north into the AIs there. Basically all the HRE is under the control of Austria at this point. We've got the Netherlands, which had been intact and at this point is occupied by France. And at this point we see what the problem is, and that is we have players on these very prominent nations. We actually have a player on Colombia as well. But there comes a point where you run out of AIs to conquer, and that's where you start to get tensions between players. Now, of course, you can have wars between players before that happens, but once AIs are no longer a viable option, now you've got some actual decisions to make. So we saw in the survey previously that players will go after AIs with maximum aggression, not hold back at all, rip apart any AIs in the vicinity. Now, when it comes to other players in the vicinity, most other players will tend to be a bit more reserved. They might not go after them unless they are looking to form a union, or they're trying to get some cores, or maybe they're just looking for that one opportunity, like something where they're not looking to take the land, but hey, if that nation's getting wrecked anyway, they might come in and take some land, something like that. And we see this happening in EU4 quite a bit. Because once all the AIs have been taken out, you've got players next to players, and when players have nowhere to expand, they have other players to expand into. Or they can go elsewhere around the map, like way far distant around the map. And when it comes to players advancing into other players, the risk is huge. The rewards tend to be small. The stakes are also huge. This is often a case where if you lose a war in one of these player versus player battles, this might be the case where you just rage quit, because once you've lost one war, you started this downward trajectory, and then it's pretty much game over. The other problem we see, though, is something that I want to point out here. So Netherlands, for example, didn't show up for the last session, and this is the save at the end of the last session, and as you can see, the Netherlands is now fully occupied by France. So we don't have protection for players in this campaign, and if you don't show up, your country is fair game. So what happens when your country that used to be a player is suddenly an AI? Well, now players are free to unleash their full aggression on that country that used to be a player but now is an AI. So they're going to do that, and they're now going to rip apart that country. And the same thing actually happened to Wallachia. So Transylvania used to be this giant vassal of Wallachia, but since Wallachia didn't show up, I went after him as Austria, Empire of the Romans went after him as well, and he's now lost a huge bit of land. And whether he comes back or not next week, we'll see. But starts a sort of positive feedback loop that unfortunately causes players to leave. So that is, if you miss a session, you're played by an AI. And if you're played by an AI, players are likely to kill you. And once players have attacked you and you have lost land, you are no longer on equal footing with everyone else. And at that point, you're less likely to come back to the campaign because you're so much farther behind everyone else. And this is why I ask people at what point they're likely to rage quit a campaign given the amount of land that they've lost. So when people say 40 or 60%, that's an interesting number, but when it comes to actual campaigns, people who've lost far less than 40 to 60% suddenly end up rage quitting. So I think that's interesting. I'm not quite sure what can be learned from that just yet, but this was something that I wanted to bring up before we get to the next couple of videos. I would say that the biggest single disruption for a multiplayer campaign in progress is leaving your country without a sub and without anyone else to take it over. Not only is a death sentence for your country, but it also completely changes the balance of powers in the area. Players rage quitting definitely impacts player wars. So as an example in this campaign, it's one that I mentioned briefly before. I'm playing Austria, and I happen to have most of the HRE under my direct control. So as far as individual players go, I am the most powerful nation on the map. But any number of players together can take me down. So France on its own can't take me down, but France and Italy and the Romans could, as a group, take me down. Any combination of players could take me down, probably any 3 players. But when it comes to one-on-one, that's no longer possible. So with the Netherlands not showing up and getting killed, if he doesn't come back, which it looks unlikely at this point that he would come back, given that he's lost some land, and it's not 40% of its land, it's not 60% of his land, but it's some land, and it's enough land that he might not decide to come back. And as a result of that, basically this whole country is gone, and that's no longer a factor when it comes to this balance of power. So France could take over the entirety of the Netherlands, or I could expand into the Netherlands and feed that to my vassals. But the fact is, this player is no longer here, and it's no longer in the equation. So same thing happened with Wallachia. So Wallachia didn't show up. He got weakened in the south because the Romans took Constantinople and northern Anatolia. I took part of Transylvania. So Wallachia has been weakened. It's not been weakened 40% versus where it was before we started the wars, but it has been weakened. So if he were to come back at this point, he would be weaker than he was when he started, but it's likely that he would not come back at all. And if that's the case, then this whole country is no longer part of the equation. So now it's just basically Austria versus any number of nations that want to join in, minus Wallachia or the Netherlands, which were pretty big powerhouses on their own. So what would happen in that case? Netherlands is out, France could expand north, Austria expands west. Wallachia is out, Austria expands east, Empire of the Romans expands north, takes the Baltic, or the Black Sea, excuse me. Yeah, so basically there's no longer this tension between the players. Now it's once again back to the state where it's player versus AI. And because there's no longer a player there, and because it's player versus AI, there's no longer any tension between the players. So it was really tense campaign up to this point because basically the AIs had been killed off. But suddenly the AIs have been reinstated, so now it's back to that mode of gameplay. Basically we're back to the early game where it's just fighting the AIs over and over. And this could last for decades potentially because there's a lot of land in the Netherlands and there's a lot of land in Wallachia. And of course Spain has other places that it can expand. The Romans has obviously Wallachia plus other places that it can expand. Italy has other places, and basically this whole aspect of the multiplayer game that made it interesting is just gutted from the game. And it's because of this player versus AI mentality, which is a natural part of the game, I think, especially in the early game, but in the late game it really kind of kills it. So what's the solution? Is it to protect the nations? I'm not sure that's really sufficient. It creates other problems of its own. Is the solution to encourage players to come back regardless of the state their nation is in? I'm not sure that's going to likely work, but it is something that people need to be aware of because when it comes to, say, for lack of a better term, the health of a campaign, this is pretty important. Even now there are people who want to restart this campaign, especially those people who have been knocked out or left the campaign on their own. And it's not that we need to restart the campaign for any particular reason. That is, there's still interesting things that can happen, but these players who have left for various reasons would rather get in at the ground level rather than continue the campaign to its conclusion. Again, I'm not sure what to do with that information just yet, but these shifting balances of power definitely don't help. There are problems with protection, though. People abuse it. That's also not fair when the nation's powerful. So what ends up happening is you have like the Ottoman Empire would get protected, and then it just declares war on people and just destroys them. Because it's like, yeah, it's protected, you can't attack it. And then it's the Ottomans, you know, so it just kills you. Or same thing with France, you know. France is protected, and you're playing Spain, and then you just get fucked. Let's say you were to win against France as Spain, but they're protected, so you can't take anything. So it goes both ways, I guess is what I'm saying. I've seen it work both ways, and sometimes it's just really dumb. So I wanted to jump over to Victoria 2 for a moment just to point out a couple of things. In Victoria 2, unlike U4, the cost of individual states and the cost of land is substantially higher. So a single state might cost you 11 infamy, which is approximately half of all of your infamy that you can have at any given point. And when it comes to colonies, you're basically 5 colonies is going to max you out. So the considerations are similar in Victoria 2, but it's a bit more distributed. So typically players end up on the majors, and that can mean top 8, that can mean top 20, that can mean a number of unsuvs as well. But basically the nations that you can expand into that don't have players on them are fairly limited. So usually on a day 1 multiplayer campaign, day 1 in a multiplayer campaign, you're going to see a whole lot of justifications on targets of opportunities. So that is, what land can people get as quickly as possible for as low of a risk as possible, and or putting all of their eggs in one basket in some cases. So this would be, you know, the rushed wars between France and Prussia, the rushed wars between Austria and Italy, that sort of thing, maybe even Russia. Maybe Russia taking a bite out of Prussia if they want to keep the NGF from forming. But really, everything's going to go crazy in the first year in a multiplayer game. But after that, things start to settle down a bit, and it's the same sort of considerations. But anyway, in Victoria 2, you've got a number of usual suspect nations that have players on them, and you have a number of nations that usually don't. So a good example of this might be Portugal. So if you're playing as Spain, and if you are going for the low risk, low reward approach, then it is very easy to expand into Portugal, and there's a few states here that you can take. Fairly low risk, usually no one defends them, and you can expand safely in this manner, in an optimal manner that is suitable both for single player and for multiplayer. When we go to other nations, Prussia, for example, doesn't have that option. Prussia is going to be surrounded by players, but basically Prussia is a little bit limited in this regard, so it might be able to expand north into Scandinavia if there's no player there, or might try going down into Switzerland. But very likely it's going to be surrounded on all sides by players, so it doesn't have the luxury of going in a single player mode against an adjacent AI the way Spain does. Austria has a few targets that it can go after, including Serbia, potentially in agreement with the Ottoman Empire, might go after Moldavia or Wallachia. The Ottoman Empire has a number of nations that it can expand into. Obviously the UK's got a lot of targets here in Southeast Asia and also India. But basically, for the most part, players are going to be engaged in the same sorts of considerations. That is, what sort of cost-benefit risk analysis am I going to say is the most optimal situation for the time being? And in most cases, it's going to be, I want to go after the low-risk, low-reward AI rather than going the all-out war, probably coalition situation against a player, because it's safe to go against the AI, it's easy to go against the AI, and for the most part people just aren't going to care. So nations like Tunis, Zulu, Madagascar, Sokoto, the nations down here in this area, Oman, Yemen, Abu Dhabi, Sindh, Makran, Brunei, Bali, Johor, Aceh, these are safe targets for players. They're typically the first nations to get wiped out in a multiplayer game because they're the safe nations, and then after that players will have that same situation where everyone around them is a player, all the other options for expansion are other players, and you have to make that same cost-benefit risk analysis, except now it's not just, can I take down that AI that's completely undefended? Now it's, can my alliance take down that other alliance? And in most cases, the answer is going to be no, which is why relatively few wars get declared in a Victoria 2 game versus, say, an EU4 game. Now, along the same lines as the EU4 example, the exact same thing would happen, though, if a player leaves the Victoria 2 campaign. You often see this in the case of Austria. So when Austria doesn't do well, if they lose Bohemia to NGF or Prussia, if they lose East or West Galicia to Russia, they've lost a good chunk of their pop. And again, it's not 10%, it's more than that. I wouldn't say it's 40%, but basically it's a good amount of their pop. And at that point, players often decide that the game is unrecoverable, and rather than stick it out just for the chance and the opportunity that they might get it back, they decide instead to rage quit. And when that happens, all of the other higher reward AIs have been wiped out already, so players will then turn to Austria and start carving it apart. So this is the case where Austria rage quits, and then all of a sudden what would have been just a regular Germany becomes Super Germany because it spheres and then annexes all of Austria. This is the case where Russia expands well into Hungary. It's the case where Italy expands halfway into the Balkans, further into the Balkans. I wouldn't say that's good for the health of the campaign. Now, it might be annoying for Austria to stick around if it's lost to Bohemia or East or West Galicia, but I don't know. I don't know what to do about that. I really don't. Again, I think it goes back to the survey where this is specifically why I asked people at what point they would quit the game. So if you've lost that land, you have a chance of getting it back later on, but most people, will they take that chance? Most people, I think, would say no. Some people would leave with even less than that. We've seen cases where there's been a Netherlands and a Belgium. Oftentimes they will come to blows, and if either one of them loses a state, all of a sudden, well, that's game over and they leave. And then it's up to either that other nation or that nation plus everyone around them to take over what's left of the country. And this is especially bad for Netherlands because they've got East and West Java and parts of Jambi that other players would want. So, you know, nations have a lot to lose. And again, it comes down to that risk-reward analysis. So some nations that are relatively weak have a lot to lose, and other players have more to gain from attacking them. So, but yeah, that's something to think about, and we'll get to this more later. We will come back to this later in the next video where we talk about coalitions and their effects on both EU4 and Victoria 2. And thanks for watching, and have a good one.